Freedom and censorship can't exist in the same world. And that's true whether it's the government or private corporations who do the censoring. Hi, I'm Ron Coleman, and welcome to the ColemanNation podcast. It's a show where I sit down with guests to discuss the future of free expression and thought in our interconnected world. Here we will focus on issues involving social media, cancel culture, and free expression that everybody who cares about ideas or freedom should be wrestling with. I'm very excited today to have my very good friend, the Ron Coleman of the 2020s, Gavin Wax. Kind of an inside Twitter joke. You either get it or you don't. Gavin, say hi and welcome to the ColemanNation.
Hello, Ron. It's great to be on ColemanNation, and thank you for the high praise. It's a great start to the show. Hope it doesn't go downhill from there.
Well, that's up to you, Gavin. Gavin had me on his show on the Wax Cast podcast.
In the past.
In the past. You're the best. And we had a great time that time. And we're going to talk about the things that we're supposed to talk about on thematically on this podcast in due time. But what I wanted to do, based on a conversation that Gavin and I had earlier, actually, I guess it was last week, is ask Gavin to do something that I'm not sure anyone else has done with him. Not that I have listened to every single thing, but a lot of people who will be listening to this know who Gavin is. They know how cool he is and how interesting and courageous he is. They don't necessarily know who the hell he is, where he came from, how he got to be what he is today, which is best known as the head of the New York Young Republican Club, of which I am an honorary member, not being young, but I hang around and I'm on the advisory board, thanks to Gavin's pulling me in. Gavin, how did you find yourself in that situation? Was this something handed off to you by some matron on the Upper East Side? Were you born with a silver spoon in your mouth? What's the history of the club? How do you find yourself in the middle of it?
Well, first off, Ron, we're very happy to have you as a member. You are actually an associate member, so not honorary associate. You're very much part of the corpus of this institution. We just took away your right to vote. That's the only difference that comes with your wisdom and your many years on this earth. But as far as the organization is concerned, I did not get it from a matron in the Upper East. I was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth. I am not a WASP. As many people may have suspected, I was born in a small apartment in Queens. I come from, I was raised by my mother and my grandmother, and I'm technically first gen, and went to community college, went to a city school, so I'm pretty much New York provincial as they come. But as far as the club is concerned, it does have a rich tradition going back over 100 years, starting in the 1850s with Lincoln and the rise of the Republican Party through the 1800s into the 1900s. So we have a long legacy. But when I came to take over this institution, it was kind of on its last legs. It had been mismanaged for many years. It had been neglected. It had kind of turned into a very, kind of dismal, small social clique. And we basically sort of took it over in a coup d'etat. And we used its legacy and its resources, and we're rebuilding it into a real institution again, which I think needs to be replicated across the country in terms of, youth outreach, in terms of building up the grassroots, in terms of rebuilding the party and the conservative movement. I think, what we've done here in New York and the belly of the beast could serve as an example from Manhattan to Iowa to New Jersey and back. So,
well, I think you're right. And that's part of what I want to talk about today. And we had a little bit of a preview of that in our discussion last week. How did you populate it with such hip, cool, conservative kids? I thought that perhaps in New York, upon my absence or upon my exit from the city during the last major, and it was nothing like this, the last downturn during the Dinkins administration, that reduced the population of conservatives in New York by a healthy 10%. How did you get all these cool young people to join? Where do you find them?
Well, like the old adage goes, if you build it, they will come. And we certainly built it up. And we basically everything we were told not to do, whether it was sort of embracing the right, embracing Trump, being very, outspoken, being a little edgier and more out there, all those things contributed to the growth. No one who's a Republican or conservative in New York is looking for, milquetoast Republicans. They're looking for people who are committed to their beliefs. I mean, why not? If you're going to be such a minority in such a blue area in a blue city, you might as well have organizations that stick to their values. So we did that, and we professionalized the organization. We run it like a business. We've put on great programming, great events. We've brought in great speakers, great thinkers, and influencers in the conservative right-wing movement.
You really have. Give some examples of some of the people that have come to the club and have hung out at the club in the last couple of months. It's astonishing.
We've had everyone from Ann Coulter to Michelle Malkin to Ron Coleman to Buck Sexton to Matt Gaetz to Steve Bannon to Raheem Kassam to Jack Posobiec to Mike Cernovich. And more. I mean, the list goes on. I mean, we've really had a great lineup of speakers the last 2 years. I took over in April of 2019. We had less than 100 members. We had less than 15 grand on hand. And now we have, we're pushing 600 members who are paying higher levels of dues. They're on recurring plans. And we have our own clubhouse in Manhattan for the first time in 60 years. We have close to 100 grand on hand. That was all done as a voluntary organization. And the speakers we've brought in, they've become part of the club in many ways. They've become part of our board of advisors. They've helped promote the club. And we've done great on that front. We also do socials, we do networking. So we run it like a full faceted organization. There's something for everyone. If you want to hear the speakers, you come for the speakers. If you want the socials to meet other like-minded people, you come for the socials. If you want to go on a deployment to New Jersey or Staten Island and help, work within the party apparatus, we do that too. So we try to, reach out to as many people, and we've done a great job at it, and we've only been growing. So it's been exciting times despite COVID, despite losing many of our members to the great state of Florida and elsewhere. Many conservatives have fled the city, and 2020 was rough. We were on a great trajectory. It certainly set us back a bit. We're back on pace, and we're looking to keep building it going forward.
So the club is, I think it's fair to say, a voice. And now we're going to circle back around to our theme here, which is free expression and the repression or attempts to repress that expression. I think it's fair to say that you have made yourselves heard in a way that has gotten under the skin of a few people in the political environment, not necessarily only Democrats either. Is that correct?
That's, very well put. We've made enemies on both sides of the aisle. I would even say sometimes our biggest enemies are actually fellow Republicans. Democrats, we have our ideological differences, but they kind of, we're doing our own thing, and, they'll fight us on many issues. But sometimes the worst enemies in terms of damage they've caused to us as an institution have been fellow Republicans. And it's a shame, but we do have a lot of rot in our party, and we have a lot of, people who are only looking out for themselves, call them grifters, call them what you will. But there's certainly a problem in the Republican Party and the conservative movement at large with individuals who are, less than savory and certainly not looking out for these broader principles that we're trying to advocate for.
Do I want to ask you what you're alluding to, or do I not want to ask you what you're alluding to?
It refers to many things. I mean, we've had issues over the years with many people, causing us issues, causing drama, trying to remove me, trying to sabotage our events. I mean, even recently we had the New York City sheriff show up to our venues. We believe that was an inside job. Someone wanted to screw us over. I don't believe it was a Democrat. I believe it was a Republican based on the information that they knew. We've had plenty of stuff happen over the years. We've only got, we fight it off and we move forward, but it is sad that, with the minority that we are in the city, that, the Republicans still tend to fight each other. It's a shame.
And it is a great New York Republican tradition, however. And I think, as a general rule, I think we all agree, we all observe that Democrats are better at maintaining party discipline once a candidate is chosen, certainly.
Yes.
They get into line like good Bolsheviks, perhaps.
When all the Mensheviks are dead, of course.
Right, exactly. if the Mensheviks and anyone who might be suspected of being a Menshevik wants to prove just how loyal he is to the regime. So the question I have is there something special in terms of having this independent voice, in terms of being this little bit of light in the darkness of what is, as you put it right before we started recording, Gotham in 2021, to the fact that so many events in the club have focused on getting together in person? That actual in-person touching and feeling and seeing each other and making eye contact, doesn't that make a difference? Does it make, or am I overstating the case?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we've been committed to in-person events since basically the summer of 2020. We took a short break, but we were back as soon as we could, doing outdoor events, et cetera. I reject, these virtual events. I reject any sort of normalization of this COVID insanity. I think, our membership does, our board does as well. I think that's part of, what conservatives need to fight for. We need to return to normalcy. I think that's become a plank, and it's become part and parcel to who we are as in terms of our ideology, and we want to expand on that. And I think it makes a big difference. I mean, what we're doing is we're building these social networks, we're building this social infrastructure where people have friends who are like-minded. They can build a support network. They can find others professionally or personally to help themselves either advance their careers or just have I hate to use the term safe space, but there are a lot of people in this city that had no idea that there are other people that think like them, and if they kind of are isolated like that, they'll give up on their views, or maybe they'll start to accept the left's narratives on things. So showing that there is a vibrant community of people that think the same way is important to maintaining some kind of a movement even behind the Iron Curtain. I mean, maybe that's even helped us because we're such a minority. Maybe in other parts of the country, you don't really need something like this club because everyone just kind of assumes everyone around them thinks the same. They're all Republicans, they're all conservatives to some degree. But certainly in a place like New York, if you ever want to rebuild the party and you ever want to really take back the city, which I think is possible. I think the city is very cyclical. You need something like this. So that's kind of what we're about. And I also wanted to touch on what you said before, fully agree in terms of how the left marches in lockstep. And there are things about the left and their tactics that we should seek to emulate. I don't think we should write it off. Things like community building, community organizing. I think a lot of people made fun of Obama for that, but the left has really created these networks in these cities in particular, but also more broadly, that have become committed party voters, and they're committed parts of the party machine because they've created these sort of support structures. They've created this sort of community and these bonds that normal political messaging is not going to break through. Republicans have to do the same thing to really build a loyal, organized, and effective party base, even in a place like New York.
Well, I mean, so now I want to combine 2 points you just made. One was about the building of networks and communities, and the other one is about people connecting with each other in person. One of the things we talked about last week was I raised an issue that I had been discussing with a person who I have mentioned on Twitter only as my wise friend, who shared kosher pizza with me one time, who had a very interesting insight, which immediately sounded correct to me, that what the year of lockdowns, whether or not all of us observe the whole year or not, but essentially this annus horribilis that is just, beginning to come to an end, one of the things that it has caused is a terrible rending of the social fabric. The people who used to see each other every day in the same store, the mail person, the mail carrier, the male's ex, whatever we call it these days. The people that, it's true we don't have in our automobile culture, we are a little bit more atomic than perhaps the small town ideal of 100 years ago. But people used to interact with the same people at the same coffee shop, at the same grocery store, and then all of a sudden everything became virtual. People became isolated. And when you're looking at an incipient authoritarian oligarchy, let's put it that way, which is what I think we are.
I agree.
Breaking apart social fabric like that is one of the things you would expect them to do, and they have done it. And my observation when my friend raised this was that what Gavin and company have done in New York with the Young Republicans Club is a fantastic model for rebuilding that in-person human connection.
I couldn't agree more. I think what we're seeing is the, part of this kind of decline in the West is, all these social connections and these social bonds have been broken. I mean, if you look at the heyday of this country, maybe the Gilded Age or whatever you want to say, I mean, even up until, just after World War II, I mean, people were part of multiple associations, they were part of clubs, they were part of groups, their church, Knights of Columbus, whatever it is, there was this whole network of people engaging each other socially. And I think that helped build a national consensus. It helped reduce, the partisan divide. I think a lot of people are now hiding behind screens. They don't interact with each other. They don't know what the other side is actually like or think.
Or they interact anonymously, which is brings out the very worst in people.
Exactly. And that's become, more and more prevalent, and it's leading to just further and further divisions in society. I think also just broadly, I think it's very easy to control a society if you are, the quote unquote elites, just to really, kind of make this kind of theoretical here. But, if you are to control society, atomize them. And if everyone's atomized, they're in their apartments, they're just consuming Netflix, they're working in a corporate job, and they have nothing else beyond their job and going back to their apartment, they're disconnected. They're disconnected from other people. They're disconnected from reality. They're much more susceptible to groupthink and just whatever is being pushed on them by the media and these major institutions. But that's why I think it's super important as a movement to fight back against that and not just look at things just purely in terms of politics, but also in terms of just community building and socially. And I think that's a stronger base and framework to really build a long-lasting, successful ideological movement to counter the left. But I think, you got to the root of it philosophically. I think we're facing, some major existential crises as a nation, as a society, as a civilization, because we've never become so atomized, really. I mean, you're seeing it with the breakdown of the family, the breakdown in the church, the breakdown in these voluntary organizations. I think there was a book called Bowling Alone, which really highlighted it. People are becoming lonely and they're really running off to their corners. It's not good for them psychologically. And I think COVID has only exacerbated that problem tenfold, to put it mildly. It was already going in that trend with the rise of the digital era and all these other forms of technology. But now with the COVID hysteria and the COVID mania, it's only thrown fuel on that fire. It's given people some kind of, scientific or pseudoscience and medical explanation for their isolation, and it's just added a level of neuroticism to the whole thing. So it's very unhealthy. It's very unhealthy, and I think it's a variable at play in a lot of other of our societal ills, whether it's the divides, whether it's the hatred, racially, culturally, ethnically, religiously, socioeconomically, generationally, or otherwise.
Bingo. I think you hit it. I think you're looking at the big picture that I'm seeing, and one of the things I find intriguing is that you're doing this in the city. What you're doing is in the city. There's an old saw that you go to New York City to be where 8 million people are alone. That there is this real lack of connection. But my experience as actually a city cat compared to my present, I live in a small city in New Jersey. It's not really a suburb. It's just a small city that happens to not be New York City. You can see the skyline from the moon now that they've made the buildings so ridiculous. But when I was a boy, Gavin, it was 6 stories was really all you needed. But I actually think that people connect more in a neighborhood like the Upper West Side than they do in the suburbs.
It's true. I mean, there are things about the suburbs that are very inorganic. I mean, a lot of it, the car culture and the subsidies from the federal government. I think generally speaking, most people want walkable streets where, things are close to them, whether it's their groceries, their pharmacy, where they, are near other people. I think, say what you want about Europe, but in many ways, some of their development in terms of how they build their cities and their communities is a lot closer to what would evolve naturally if we didn't have, such rigorous zoning laws and all the other restrictions on construction, and it wasn't so car centric. I think they've shown in studies and other things that it's better on people's health and mind and body, you know, when they're maybe not as dense as some parts of New York, but there is a balance between the kind of, you know, spread out car suburbs where you need a car to go everywhere and, you know, a tenement. I think there's a balance between that. And I think it used to be represented in, you know, the small American town. You think New England with their greens and their kind of sense of community there. I think we're starting to relearn that and try to apply it to how we develop, you know, cities and communities. I think that's a good thing, but I 100% agree with you.
And I think, you know, sort of going back to my theme, it's a lot easier to shut somebody up and say that they're not entitled to be heard when you're either talking anonymously or otherwise don't know them. Mm-hmm. To actually say to a person that you know and that you see every day, you know, we've concluded that you're not entitled to an opinion. That's something that only a regimented, bureaucratized, atomized society is capable of. People who know each other as human beings and treat each other as members of the same, you know, human race don't generally do that in a healthy society. I mean, obviously, you know, there are certain bars where if I were to walk into, and maybe even you, they would sniff us out in a second. And let's not be unrealistic about prejudice and open-mindedness and, you know, the good-hearted, common man. The world is a complicated place, but I still do think that part of the issue that we, you know, at the end of the day.
Well, this is why the left was trying to shut down so many, you know, conservative speakers and so much debate on campus over the last 5-6 years, because I personally knew many friends who were default Democrats who had their, their conceptions about Republicans and the right, and they would go on campus and they would see some speakers, you know, whoever it may be. They would attend some debates, they would attend some forums, and they would leave. Even if they weren't completely sold, they at least were able to break bread, so to speak, with the other side. It was humanizing, and it put things in perspective, and it became a lot hard to demonize and delegitimize the other side. So I think the left was very smart in realizing many years ago that you can't allow open debate, you can't allow these open forums, you can't allow any contact even. You need to make them the other. You need to distance your side from theirs. It needs to become almost tribalistic, and that separation physically and in whatever other sense you want to put it, that separation allows the left to demonize the right. It allows them to delegitimize the right. It allows them to, push these ever more disgusting and kind of regressive and tyrannical approaches to speech and treatment of political dissidents or minority groups politically, because now they've essentially otherize the other side, and there's no bonds, there's no communication outside of maybe a family dinner, which is kind of where a lot of the jokes you see on Twitter, it's like, oh, you have to go back to see family and you see your Republican uncle or something, because outside of that there's nothing else.
Once or twice a year, that's the big dinner.
And they're still trying to get rid of that too. Now they're trying to turn the families against each other, hate mom and dad, institutionalize these kids even earlier with daycare, and really push them away from their parents as far as they can, which is really what upset me about that latest GOP tweet where they said, oh God, can you believe it? Mothers are spending more time with their children. They need to get back to their cubicles at once for the GDP. And it's like, this is supposedly the party of the family, of religion, of traditional values. And here they are just kind of sounding like an HR department.
Well, that is a very, very awkward space, because this is something that my wife and I discuss frequently. I mean, she made gigantic sacrifices. She got into Stanford Law School and I didn't. She's a very, very smart person with a legal education, and rather than practice law full time, she raised our children into some very, very impressive young men, and that was because their mother was around. People can be impressive young people with, not always having two parents around, not always having both parents around, but you want to give your children every chance. On the other hand, the economics, there's a dichotomy, right? I mean, the one hand, to get by, you have to get by. And if you don't have a choice but to live in a major urban area where it's expensive to live, you've got a dilemma. On the other hand, to have a certain kind of lifestyle, we both work because we want to be able to ski every year. We both work because we want to have a 7-bedroom house. But I guess that's a topic for a different issue. I actually want to go back.
Well, I think it ties in.
Yeah.
I think
yes.
it goes
Tell
to
me.
this broader decline of the West, and that, I think most people's general preferences would be for what you described, this kind of comfortable middle class lifestyle with a family, with multiple kids. But economically, it's become hard just because of the pressures of higher costs of living and more demanding jobs. And then culturally, it's been ingrained in many people that families are bad, families are stupid, homemaking is stupid. It's repressive to be a mother. It's evil to be a mother. You're much happier, working a soulless job somewhere. I think you have this cultural pressure from the media and the institutions. You have this economic pressure from, the money printing and all the other elements that are going on in our economy that's driving up the cost of living. And it's really led to a breakdown of the family. It's led to a decline in birth rates. And overall, I think our society is suffering because of it. And I think some people like to point to just one aspect, the economy. Others like to just point to the cultural elements, but it's kind of holistic in terms of how the West has really come under, just a lot of strain in terms of basic foundations of family building and wealth creation and moving up the socioeconomic ladder. It's become harder and harder, despite maybe our technological advances and other things that make it seem like we've become more prosperous, but in many areas we haven't.
You're right. You're 100% right. And those things they all listen, at a certain point, it's a singularity, right? There's this secular decline. There's this whole idea that a lot of the things that we thought of as progress have actually been taken off the table. We should see people, what technology does is enables us to be more productive than we were before. And instead, we're somehow poorer, not only spiritually and socially, but economically. Only an elite, people who are in knowledge-oriented businesses, or who are in technology, or who are in the business of moving money around, or of course people on Wall Street who are in the legalized, well, what do you even call it? I mean, it's the Wall Street racket, whatever we want to call it. Those sectors are getting wealthier, and ironically, the way the Democrats, again, going back to their excellent messaging, did to grab onto that, notwithstanding that their policies are the engine for so much of what we're complaining about, is say, it's also all about student loans. Let's cancel all the student loans, which is just, you've got moral hazard. You've got so many reasons. It's such a bad policy for so many reasons, but it's exactly the way they operate.
And their policies created that issue to begin with. So they've created an issue and now they're the savior. They created this non-existent issue pushing for affordable college, but obviously they guarantee and they underwrite the loans, and that led to just massive price inflation with schools. And then people were graduating with a mortgage, and now their whole life is consumed by paying down this debt and taking on,
And what kind of education do they have?
And they're not even getting an education. They're not getting an education that helps them with employable skills, and they're also not getting more of a traditional liberal arts education. They're not learning about how the world works, so they're just getting propaganda. I mean, there used to be kind of this divide. I remember, there's the more working class Joe. It's like, oh, learn to weld, learn to make, learn these hard skills, which is good. And then there was another side that said, oh no, you need to learn the classics. You need to learn, what Plato said. You need to learn, the way of the world. But what's funny now is we're getting neither. They're getting just this kind of this indoctrination, this Marxian dialectic. That's all they're getting. They're just getting propaganda. They're not getting, either the real world hard skills to be employable, and they're not getting the more lofty, liberal arts education. And I say that, what it used to be, not what it means today, of learning how the world works and learning, the history, and learning, how to be a better person, how to be a better society. They're getting neither. They're just coming out indoctrinated, dumber, lazier, more entitled, and then they're loaded with a lot of debt, and they're getting they have no opportunity to make money. They have fewer job opportunities. The jobs they get are not as rewarding as they may have once been. They don't pay as much. So there are legitimate grievances that people in my generation and the generation below me are facing. But the left, it's just funny. They create the problem. Now they're going to provide the solution, which is just going to be more control and more strings and more government overreach.
And you talk about the nature of the old liberal arts education, and you mentioned earlier about how long ago the left began its indoctrination processes, especially on the campuses. When I arrived at Princeton in 1981, and I mentioned elites before, you and I have discussed this, neither one of us comes from an elite family. I also, for all practical purposes, a second-generation American. My mother is an immigrant. My father was an orphan, raised by an immigrant. And I somehow found myself at Princeton. And the first political and public event that I encountered there was a lecture by the Reverend Jerry Falwell, who, of course, was the head of the moral majority, who was the first well-known public figure in my lifetime to flex the muscles of evangelical Christians in politics. And I wasn't able to get a ticket because the auditorium they were using was not all that large and it was sold out. But I was able to sort of see from the outer corridor. And what I saw was that about a third or a quarter of the people who had gotten tickets had used the opportunity to stand up and turn their backs to him while he spoke. That was what I learned. The first thing I saw at Princeton was that rather than either engage him in debate or let other people have the opportunity to listen to him, the performance of coming in, taking up seats, and turning around to demonstrate your moral superiority based on your exquisite moral training as a 19-year-old was the priority. And at that time, I would say that the Ivy League schools still had offered a pretty good education.
But in terms of the things this has gone on for, this didn't happen
that's right.
overnight. It didn't happen right after Trump was elected. It didn't just happen in the Obama years. This has been an issue with these higher education institutions for decades, for generations, where they've become everything they've become antithetical to their supposed founding principles of education and open forms of discussion, discourse, and the exchange of ideas. They've become kind of just daycare essentially for entitled brats. And a lot of them have produced brilliant minds. They've produced many, great engineers, great doctors, great lawyers, great thinkers, and it's given them this sort of institutional reputation that shields them from a lot of legitimate criticism. But that reputation that these institutions have built up over the years, they're just leveraging it, and they're drawing a ton of capital from it to promote these kind of childlike woke ideologies. And I think we're starting to hit a point in society where the respect for these institutions is beginning to really decline, and people's realization of what they've become is starting to rise. And I think that doesn't bode well for them in terms of how they're going to be able to last, how they're going to be able to continue to do business effectively, how they're going to be able to, cling on to this reputation that they earned in a bygone era of being, real centers of learning and academics, which many of them are hardly anymore. Obviously, some schools are worse than others, and there's certain divisions between the Ivy Leagues and other schools, state schools, public schools, whatever it is. But I think a lot of people are now waking up to the value of what a degree really is now, what you're actually learning from there. And I think it's a good thing. I think as a society, I think it's a good thing that we're moving away from such a college degree oriented society where if you don't have one, or you didn't, do full 4 years or whatever it is, that you're less of a human. I think a lot of people are realizing you can learn. So there's a lot of self-learning. You can get access to all these materials and professors' classes online for basically nothing, and you could get the same level of education without spending it, without exposing yourselves to the indoctrination, and without going into debt. So I think these are positive developments, but it's crazy to think how long this has been brewing on for. I mean, even before your time. I mean, you go back to the free speech movement and a lot of the liberals and the hippies on the West Coast. I mean, a lot of those schools were dominated by the the cultural left. And, you know, in many ways, some of them were a little better. Maybe some of them did support free speech. Maybe they were anti-war. And, you know, there were some values of theirs that could be described as liberal, quote unquote. But their second generation, the ones that came after them and now are replacing them in the administration, are just completely off the reservation Marxists. And there's just been no pushback from a lot of people. And
bingo.
Yeah, and that's the problem.
Bingo. That's the point, is that, you know, as an idealistic and naive non-member of this, you know, class that I was observing, this, what we might call a nascent class of professional complainers, I felt so incredibly grateful to be at this unbelievable institution. I could not, it was like being admitted to Jupiter for college. It was, you know, my father burst into tears when they dropped me off at Princeton. He could not believe, given his upbringing, what he was seeing me walk into. And then I see the way people treated others who disagreed with them. And what astonished me was they were being allowed to get away with it. Where were the adults? Where were the authority figures who were supposed to be teaching and guiding the young minds? And it reminded me exactly of what you're talking about, because I grew up 20 years earlier in the 60s, and I remember hearing about riots and about libraries being burned, and I remember thinking to myself, as I was unfortunately a little bit too plugged into the news for a little kid, I'm wondering, why are they allowed to do that?
Right. And I think there was a blasé mentality that sort of took over in the United States. It's like, oh, well, they're just kids. They're going to grow up, and, you know, they grow up and they get a family, they get a job, then they'll become conservative. Let them have their kind of radical fun now, whatever. And they kind of just let this go on, and it festered, and it's becoming a real problem, and it's leading to a lot of cultural, institutional, and societal rot. Because maybe in the 60s, you know, many people thought, oh, you know, these hippies, just let them be, you know, they'll grow up sooner rather than later. But they never did grow up. And then, you know, the next generation only got worse, because we kind of let our guard down. We let our standards be lowered, and we didn't put our foot down as a society to say, listen, you know, this kind of behavior is not acceptable. This kind of behavior is not conducive to learning. It's not part of what higher education is about. And you know, you guys should really, you know, quote unquote, check your privilege, because unlike you, I'm sure many of the people there did come from, you know, some kind of family money, and they did come from, you know, well-to-do families, and this was their way to virtue signal. This was their way to, you know, tell mom and dad how bad they were for being part of, you know, this petite bourgeoisie in America. But a lot of people there, you know, like yourself and maybe others who were first people to go to college. I was the first people. Neither of my parents went to college. They were there actually for an education. They weren't there to promote their virtue and to show, you know, how rebellious they are and how forward thinking they were. They were there for an actual education to better themselves and to live a better life than their families. So I think that kind of class divide is also part of it. And I think a lot of people are only beginning to really talk about it.
And we were only beginning to talk about all these things, Gavin, and I'm so glad that you and I are having these conversations, both sharing them with our podcast listeners and the ones that you and I have on a very frequent basis. That's exactly what the bad guys don't want to have happen. They don't want these things to be discussed. They don't want us to be heard. And I think so far we're being tolerated. And we might be tolerated for the long run because we're not all that threatening in and of ourselves. We've probably both walked up to the line a few times. I would give anything to know whether we were ever on any agendas. I went for a couple of months where my follower growth on Twitter was absolutely capped. It was 127.8. And that was the number. And it was just ridiculous because I would see new people following me every day and the number would never change. And that was, I think, a little way of Big Brother just sort of touching me on the back of the hand and saying, I'm here.
It's sad because it's such a manipulated platform. I had someone tweet at me, I think this morning or yesterday, saying, I've had to follow Gavin 3 times. And I know him personally, and he was very confused by it. I think, if these platforms were completely organic and they weren't manipulated and they weren't being run through some algorithms, I think a lot of voices on the right would have, 2-3x the number of followers. They would have 2-3x the reach. If they gave out blue checks to the right by the same standards they give it to the left, I think a lot more of these accounts would grow even more just by having that kind of verification. But these are the subtle things they've been doing for who knows how long, to sort of minimize our side, minimize our voices, and minimize our ideas. And it's effective. It's definitely been working.
So things like Substack and podcasting, even though podcasting, you have to, if you don't play, if you go too far over the line, you could get yanked off Apple or some of the other major platforms. But there are many, many ways to distribute podcasts. You started one sometime last year. There is a tremendous opportunity through these unregulated channels to continue the conversation, if indeed there is such a thing as privacy and there is such a thing as unmonitored speech, and that's an open question.
Unfettered discussions.
Unfettered discussion, that's the Clubhouse quotation, of course. I think that even though it might be naive to think that they can't and won't try to shut people down there, that we need to be heard everywhere. We need to be heard also, going back to my original point, in person, to each other, sitting down at the same table and bending the elbow and having these in-person experiences like every time I open my email, okay, I never close my email, but I'm constantly getting notices of a new event at the New York Young Republican Club. It's another in-person event. It's another opportunity to see the gang. And I think it's just fantastic what you're doing. Is there a vision? Is there something that we should be looking for in the future, not just for the club, but for you, Gavin?
I mean, I'm always just, we're looking to build it up, to grow it. I would love, to constantly bring in bigger and more speakers. I mean, we've had a bit of a rough time with the restrictions in New York. That's why we had to get our own venue, our own clubhouse to host. We're kind of like a speakeasy of organizations, so to speak, because we have to kind of hide here. We can't publish our address, all that sort of thing. I mean, the vision of the club is to build something lasting. I want it to last another 100 years. I want it to become a place where people could come, could exchange ideas, all the things we're talking about that should be happening on campus.
Speakeasy is a good word.
Yeah,
actually.
A cultural speakeasy, so to speak. We do have alcohol, but, we also have dissident ideas, and we were also promoting things that are counter to the orthodoxy. So, and as far as I'm concerned, look, I'm always trying to build my reach and constantly just try to, engage with other people. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. And I think, more of these are better. And obviously, podcasts are still kind of the Wild West of media. Soon they will be, they will clamp down on them, but that's why we need to take an all of the above approach to get our ideas out there, kind of like the pamphleteers of old, just spread it far and wide as far as you can. And that's why I also reject, a lot of conservatives and people on the right retreating to their ideological ghettos on things like Parler and Gab. As much as I have respect for those sites and what they're trying to do, I think, just preaching to the choir constantly and just kind of talking in an echo chamber is not going to do anything. We need to be on the major platforms, even if we are a minority, even if it is very oppressive in terms of, how they conduct themselves. So Twitter is horrible in terms of how it's run. I have nothing but bad things to say about Jack Dorsey and team, but they have the biggest reach. They have the most eyeballs, and, we have to keep staying on these platforms and getting our message across until, they fully ban all of us, which may be soon. Maybe it's next week. Maybe it's in a month. Who knows?
You nailed it, Wax. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being so flexible about timing and joining us as one of my very first guests. You and I have become very friendly in the last year or so, and I hope that it continues. And see you at the club very soon.
Yeah, this was great. I wish we had another hour. We could have talked about even more.
No, we'll have to do it again soon. All right, so long.
Thank you, Ron.
Thanks. Hey, thank you for listening to the ColemanNation podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. If you like the show, please rate it 5 stars and leave a review. For more information, please visit the show's website at ColemanNation.com. That's Coleman-Nation.com. Or you can visit my blog at likelihoodofconfusion.com. Join us next time on the Coleman Nation podcast and have a great day.